Oof, okay, now there was a lot of studies on the influence of mood on judgments and processing information, but what about specific emotions? Let's move on to look at how specific emotions affect our cognitions. First of all, we have to talk about emotions in a bit more detail. So often we differentiate 6 basic emotions according to Enkman. That would be anger, fear, disgust, surprise, happiness, and sadness. And the idea here is that these emotions are basic because they're universally recognized. There's also an argument to be made that specific facial muscles are used to produce these expressions that go along with these emotions. And sometimes a 7th one is also considered, which would be contempt. For these specific emotions, we have to consult appraisal theories. The idea is that emotions result from our interpretations, the cognitive appraisals, hence the name of the theories, of specific events. So that emotions trigger changes in cognition, physiology, such as our facial expressions, and also subsequent behavior, which then can persist beyond the situation that has actually elicited this specific emotion. Now, if we follow the ideas of Smith and Ellsworth, then we would say that emotions have central dimensions of appraisal, or kind of themes that differentiate them. So one of these dimensions is valence. Is the emotion positive or negative? The other dimension would be the cause. Is there a situational cause from the environment, or does the emotion arise because of a personal cause? And then the last dimension would be whether there is certainty, or the degree to which people have control over the emotions. Do they have lots versus little control? And if we use these appraisal dimensions, we can tell specific emotions apart. For instance, if we wanted to tell apart fear, anger, and happiness, and we consulted these dimensions, we would say that, first of all, in terms of valence, it's clear that fear and anger are negative, while happiness is positive in terms of valence. Now, next, if we look at whether the cause of the information is personal or situational, well, it's really difficult to tell these apart for fear, anger, and happiness, because both could be true, right? Both for fear, anger, and for happiness, it could be the case that the emotion arises from ourselves, from personal reasons, or that it is situationally determined. But we can use the control dimension to differentiate, before we've already differentiated fear and anger versus happiness just by valence. But now if we wanted to tell the difference between fear and anger, which are same on valence and potentially the same on where the locus of the causation was, we might use the 3rd dimension, which is how much control participants, or people, I shouldn't say participants all the time, how much control people have when experiencing this this emotion. And usually for fear, there would be low feeling of control, and therefore being fearful because you feel like you are not in charge. In anger, however, being a feeling where people have higher perceptions of control, where they feel like they can do something. So this means if we wanted to tell apart happiness versus fear versus anger, we could ask ourselves, what are the differences in the positive versus negatively valence emotions? Or we might also ask along the scale of, or the dimension of certainty and control. So then the interesting bit would be, what is the difference between fear and anger? So you could ask yourselves, do angry people feel more and think more like happy people, or more like fearful people? Because so far we have exactly one difference between happiness and fear as compared to anger, right? And we could ask ourselves what kind of behaviors and judgments these different emotions elicit, and we could try to make predictions that differ according to these dimensions that we have just introduced. So if we were to look at anger versus fear, Here is a study that we could consult in terms of finding evidence for how specifically anger compared to fear changes how people think. In this study, there was an emotion induction task that either elicited fear or anger, and participants were asked to describe 3 things that made them fearful or angry, and then describe in more detail the situation that made them most fearful and most angry. So in a way, it's like an adapted version of autobiographical recall. And following this emotion induction task, there was an optimism or risk perception measure. And participants were asked to estimate the likelihood of various events happening to them at some point in their life. They were asked about whether they felt that this was in their personal control or in a situational control, and whether they thought it was predictable or unpredictable. So these events that participants rated were things like, my car will be stolen, I will be injured in a car accident, I will develop cancer, and so on and so forth. Things like, I will get an award at work. So stuff that might happen to someone in their life. Now, if we take a look at the results, what we can see here is the ratings of participants in terms of how much they felt in control over these life events, how certain that they were going to happen, and how optimistic they were in terms of the risk. And you can see plots for fearful people in the fearful condition in light gray and in the anger condition in black. And what you can see is that people in the anger condition felt more in control over these life events happening. They barely deviated from 0 in terms of being certain that they would happen, so meaning they were rather uncertain, where fearful people felt more certain in this case. And in terms of being optimistic, actually there wasn't a big difference between fearful and angry, and except for the directionality of the effect. Right? So this would be evidence that indeed the control appraisals differed for people who were fearful and those who were angry. Consider this other study that again is about the anger versus fear influence on cognitions, where participants were asked to read the following text. It goes like this: the terrorist attacks evoked a lot of emotion in Americans. We are particularly interested in what makes you the most, and here's our manipulation, angry or afraid about these attacks. Please describe in detail the one thing that makes you most angry or afraid about the attacks. Try to write your description so that someone reading it might even get angry or afraid from learning about the situation. So again, this is a task that is really similar to autobiographical recall, where participants are put in the angry versus afraid state of mind. And in this case, there was again a measure of risk. So the participants were confronted with the idea that safety in airline travel will improve dramatically as a result of the major terrorist attacks. And they were asked to rate if this was extremely likely or extremely unlikely to happen. Another question for them was another major terrorist attack would occur within the next 12 months, or the United States would be able to capture Osama bin Laden, and that was in 2003 before that had actually happened. So participants were asked to assess these, the likelihoods of these events. Now here is the data. And if you look at the data, what we can see here is that, first of all, there's somehow there's a gender difference between male and female participants, but let's discard that for now. What we have is the risk of future events for the United States, the rating of risks happening, and they could either be relatively likely or relatively unlikely. And what we can see is that in the anger condition, the likelihood of further risks to the US was rated as lower than in the fear condition. So people who were induced to be angry were more optimistic than people who were induced to experience fear, in that they experienced lower risk of aversive events happening in the US. And now this you can't tell from the graph, but I can tell you this from the paper. So they also, people in the anger condition also support different policies from those in the fear condition. So in the anger condition, people were more in favor of deporting foreigners without valid visas. And in the fear condition, people were more in favor of strengthening ties with Muslim countries. So here we have evidence that anger versus fear indeed change how we appraise our environment, how risky we perceive specific environments to be, and then downstream also have effects on behavior, or at least behavioral intentions, as the support for different policies here. Now, lastly, I want to bring up some experiment at Tilburg University. The idea that feeling is for doing, so that emotions don't only inform us about the present situation, but they also motivate us and energize us to behave in a certain way. So in that sense, they're actually functional. So being emotional or reacting to the emotions that we experience isn't only like a mistake, but it's actually a functional part of how we as humans interact with our environment. So different emotions are thought to have sort of raise different concerns which require different solutions. So if someone is fearful, that means they are in a state where they want to protect themselves from threats. And protecting themselves from threats is best done by choosing to flee and avoiding certain problems. If someone is in an angry state, that means they are their concern would be to remove an obstacle, and therefore the solution would be to fight and to approach. Disgust puts us in a frame to try to achieve the goal of rejecting or avoiding contamination with the stuff that is disgusting. And therefore, as you can see already by my gesturing, this would be something that makes us avoid stuff. While if we're happy, well, this is a moment for bonding socially and for intimacy, and this is a moment for approaching. So even closely related emotions, if you follow this feeling is for doing idea, even closely related emotions may have different effects. For instance, shame and guilt, or regret and disappointment. And often we can manage to plot these on the dimension of avoidance versus approach. So overall, if we looked at the role of informations for behavior, we could say that emotions are actually crucial for decision making and for behavior, because they provide affective signals or kind of somatic markers that tell us what's important, what we desire, what we find risky, and they can help us prioritize. But as we've seen, they can also sometimes get in the way. So whatever you do, don't underestimate the role of emotions for cognitions and for downstream behavior. And after this lecture series, of course, you would never do that, because today we've talked about all these topics here. We've started by defining the difference between affect, mood, and emotion. We've talked about how to induce affect in the lab, and then we've taken a whole look at different explanations of how mood influences cognitions. And finally, we've taken a quick stroll through specific emotions and how they can affect cognitions and subsequently behavior. That's it for this session. Thank you for joining, and I'll see you in the next installment of Social Cognition.